So in our current real-life human society, most of us have reached the conclusion that race is a construct. Aside from eugenics and basic ignorance, we can all agree race has no bearing on how any person develops differently from any other. Save for melanin, which, let's be real, isn't enough. Obviously, there's an ethnic and cultural dimension to this, and when I say race is a construct, I mean that it is only that. There's no real genetic component to it that has any impact on how people develop or their certain talents or dispositions for things. With that messiness out of the way, it begs the question of why we call different kinds of creatures in fantasy race and not species. You see, I would argue that while orcs are humanoid, they're not a race of humans. That is, unless you're the asshole who wrote Bright, or just kind of like racism in your fantasy world, it's not entirely fair to reference race as creatures who are distinctly different based on physiological traits. Gnomes are a different species from humans. Elves are a different species from humans. They're all sentient, intelligent humanoids, but with different physiological adaptations suited to their origin, making them not races, but entirely different species. Regardless of tactless racial critiques in fantasy, the concept of speciation is an interesting one, and I think the term race is fine to use. It does feel necessary to delineate between the two terms, not only for the sake of being PC, but also to flesh out the different elements of your world and story. Some people say the same race must create fertile offspring, but just the same coyotes, wolves, and dogs, all separate species, can in fact produce fertile offspring when they breed. So D&D and a lot of other fantasy allows the different humanoids to reproduce. That's how we get half-orcs, half-elves, etc., and that makes these tropes qualify as race by some definitions. Likewise, in a cultural context, the separate traditions and groups that develop could also qualify as race. In short, there's no right answer. I'm going to use some case studies from popular fantasy in the real world so we can all figure out how to world build this sticky and massive concept to our liking. In real life, it's all about those genes and that sweet, sweet geography. Honestly, it's pretty complicated, and there are many different ways for species to disperse in this lovely world of ours. I'm just gonna flash pictures instead of explaining all the ways. While some may wrongly argue melanin levels are enough to classify races as being different, the multitude of physiological and biological factors all humans have in common is enough to completely cancel out this ludicrous idea. All of our skulls are the same, and the scientific community has essentially been in agreement on this for the last 100 or so years. Don't at me. And so be it your levels of melanin or the ethnicity that develops, I do think that both of those are a product of geography in the real world. Likewise, in fantasy, a lot of these traits also develop as a result of geography and occasionally gods. That's where it gets messy. First, we're going to look at scientific race divides in fantasy, and then we're going to look at divine. Georgie Boy is very scientific. He took a lot of influence from H.P. Lovecraft, known racist, and sci-fi. Likewise, his world is populated by different species of humans that have evolved based on their local geography. Most notably, the water people. This is a very unique way of addressing race in fantasy, or species, because it follows science instead of tropes. This is a neat idea, and like every fantasy world builder, I jerk myself raw to this every single night. In all honesty, it's probably that weird Lovecraft stone, but again, he doesn't really explicitly say that, and he's got a pretty good diverse cast of humans and other races based on geography, so while this might not be what the author meant, he does make a good case study for it regardless. Not racist. It's my personal opinion that Lord of the Rings is the greatest tale ever told. Some aspects of it are problematic, but god damn does it read a hell of a lot better than the Bible. Tolkien's origin story for races has to do with divine magic. The elves are the Aryan children of the gods, and the dwarves are the mess-ups made from stone. Men fall as bastards somewhere near the middle of this continuum. The point is, Tolkien said, "F*** your science," and explained races by divine right, which at the time was still a popular and extremely wrong real-world theory. Yet, even in the 50s, he was still able to be more tasteful than bright. Could be racist. Whew, so what did we learn? While it's not entirely fair to say Tolkien hated black people, it's equally unfair to say Georgie Boy addressed the subject perfectly. These are two distinctly different approaches to adding elements of race and speciated humanoids to a world, and while it's dubious either attempted a political hot take with this, we can learn from how society responded and mold our worlds accordingly. I personally would never create divine races, because it's messy, been done, and rife for misinterpretation. Likewise, so is geography. So is race. This video is so full of contradictions because I've tried to answer something that doesn't really have an answer. So is your fantasy world racist? Maybe. Probably if you dig deep enough. All I really have are some hot tips on avoiding sticky situations. I would say safe whitewashing for the fences. You know, fantasy has enough white people in it, you might as well stick true to your climate belts. I don't think it's bad if you just want to have whitewashed fantasy, but at the same time, you're just joining the legions of people that have already done that. If you're not really evil, you just kind of perpetuate a cycle that I think is ultimately problematic for a genre that's been constrained by said cycle. I mean, I feel like divine race origins are fine, you just have to explain it in a way that can't really have parallels drawn to the real world. I mean, the society we come from is racist as That's why it matters that we think about how we say these things if we want our story to be received by a greater audience than just a bunch of white people. And so does intention matter, I think, is a question we're kind of forced to ask, and yeah, it does. If you intended to make your race of beast people an allegory for racism that was caused by the divine will of a god, that's pretty racist. I think that was your intention. If you just write out all of your lore and realize that's something people could walk away with, maybe tweak it a little bit to make yourself look like less of a racist. I mean, some people just don't care. I mean, you could be a Lovecraft, but I think that we're past the age of that being, like, widely acceptable. I mean, it's a story, it's a world, it's immersive, it's interpretive. People are gonna take different things based on what you've created and the parallels you've drawn to your known experience. So, I mean, it's just kind of a matter of being tasteful. You know, I'm conflicted. I let orcs and people, like, reproduce and create offspring, but generally, hybrid offspring between two different humanoid species aren't fertile. Is that racist? Dude, I don't know. I don't want to unpack that, but I think it mechanically checks out with what we know from the real world. It's all about what you let people take from how you write your story. And I'm not trying to get political, I'm just trying to iron out some concepts about fantasy, the genre, and how people react to it that I've been thinking about for a while. You know, I'm not trying to piss anyone off or get under anyone's skin or insult your favorite stories. I'm just trying to start a dialogue about something I feel like is relevant. So, as always, Internet, thanks for watching. This has been Lizard with the Gold Star World Builders Club. Out.